Hello! Today I'm continuing with my Final Fantasy Summons mini-series and taking a look at the enigmatic and foreboding Dark Knight, Odin. Now, as with Shiva and Ifrit, Odin was a debutante of the summonable creatures back in Final Fantasy III, and it's appeared in most subsequent installments, with a few notable exceptions. However, unlike Shiva and Ifrit, Odin is not representative of, or a personification of, any particular element, and rather, for the most part, he's relied upon non-elemental and non-status altering physical attacks, which in most instances were endgame manoeuvres that cause a critical hit or instant death. So, in this episode, as with the others, I'm going to summarise Odin's characteristics, features and design, and jumping right in with the naming conventions and cultural source material for this summon, we turn once more to Germanic paganism and Norse mythology, whose pantheon of gods was led by the warrior called Woden, and the later, more popular designation of Odin. And it's interesting to consider what in particular they've adopted here, how the Odin of Final Fantasy has woven in with the mythological counterpart, and how, as with the other summons, it's evolved to become something uniquely its own within the mythology of the Final Fantasy game series. And looking at these creation stories, we know Odin to be the god of gods, the patriarch and primary deity in many belief systems, most famously among the Vikings. And such is his prominence, he has many things that are symbolically attributed to him and associated with him, from the word Wednesday, or Woden's Day, to the act of war. And it's this in particular that emerges when we turn to look at the Final Fantasy equivalent of Odin, because he is almost always presented as a formidable warrior who performs devastating physical attacks capable of causing instant death. So I think this characterization of him really lends to his origins as a god of war. Additionally, the status of king or chieftain among the gods is a consistency that we can see in the Final Fantasy Odin if we scratch below the surface. So for example, we often need to seek him out and earn Odin as a summon, and he's often presented in a pseudo-regal setting, such as when he's sitting on a throne in Final Fantasy VIII, when we finally confront him. Beyond this, there are several other analogues to the Norse stories on a more symbolic level. For example, the god's affinity for and association with horses is referenced by the summon almost always riding a horse into battle in his cutscene. And in some cases, Square even went a step further and seemed to reference Odin's own magic horse, Sleipnir, which is an 8-legged beast. And for example, in Final Fantasies 7, 8 and 9, we see Odin riding a 6-legged horse, which isn't quite there, perhaps because of technical limitations, but I think it's close enough to be a conscious association with this Norse source material. Along with Sleipnir, the god Odin is often portrayed with other significant items, such as ravens, but more specifically the spear, Gungnir. And this is another clear reference that's made in Final Fantasy games, as there's an ability called Gungnir that Odin uses, sometimes bastardized as Gunglance. And this is a maneuver in which Odin throws a spear as a lesser physical attack to his primary attack, which is Zantetsuken. But I will say that while Gungnir is usually presented as a secondary attack, there is an excellent cutscene in Final Fantasy IX where Odin uses the spear to attack and completely obliterate the settlement of Clara, so results do vary. So, looking at this, it is interesting to see how Odin has been appropriated by the Final Fantasy team and has retained several elements from his origin stories. And while he's been omitted in a couple of games, most apparently to me being Final Fantasy X and Final Fantasy XV, and in the former I can understand why, because in Final Fantasy X the summons were intended to be much more beast-like and animalistic for the most part. So for example, we had Valefor and Ixion replacing earlier summons. But in Final Fantasy XV, I felt that hosting a pantheon of deities was quite a promising place to have a summon that is so closely associated with a real-world god figure. But that's by the by, and thinking about it, I think making Bahamut the god king in Final Fantasy XV did make sense owing to Bahamut's repute and status within the worlds of Final Fantasy specifically. So, digression aside, looking finally at Odin's design, I think this is where we start seeing a departure from his source material and the Norse and Germanic lore, because Square really went to town in repackaging him in a pseudo-medieval knight sort of attire, and for the most part in each of the games he's presented in chainmail and pleated armour, and even his warhorse is often barbed with pleats of mail, so very much a 14th century vibe emanating from Odin, which is quite at odds with the Viking and pre-Viking era origins of these stories. But that's by no means a criticism, and what I think is great about Square is how they adopt these elements from history and reforge them into something uniquely Final Fantasy. And the sword, Zantetsuken, is a great emblem of that, because while it has no real-world source or connotation to Odin, or indeed any god, it's become synonymous with the summon across various Final Fantasy titles, and is often a much sought-out item that's associated with him. So it's representative of Final Fantasy and how it's taken on mythologies of its own, with its own pantheon of deities, which in many ways has respected, but also radically departed from these origin stories in quite significant ways. It's also prudent to note by way of design that Odin is presented as quite a grim, silent and forbidding figure in Final Fantasy games, with red eyes and a blank expression. And that's another thing I really like, because looking at the Norse stories, as opposed to the Greeks, where everyone, for the most part, seems to be drinking and fornicating, the Norse tales are very grim. They have rare moments of respite or comfort or moral justice. And indeed, the famous Ragnarok event, which is the end times in the Norse canon, is an instance where even the gods themselves are killed off in battle, and so, opposed to the eternal, undying deities in other belief systems, the Norse gods are finite beings that suffer the slings and arrows of war and mortality, and so I feel that really transcribes well and is apparent in the grimness of the Odin character in Final Fantasy. So, that about wraps up my brief summary of Odin and the influences of Norse stories in the Final Fantasy games. And if you got this far, thanks very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. And I'll be doing some more summon summaries over the coming weeks and months, so do consider subscribing, or check back for some more origin stories.